We are going to wrap up our study of Ecclesiastes today by talking about the theme of time. And when I kind of previewed this study guide and I was looking through the different weeks, I remember looking through this week several months ago and being excited about it and thinking, oh, I can't wait till we get to week 7. I'm really going to enjoy that lesson. And I have to say I really enjoyed looking at the passages that we're going to look at today, because we get to look at probably 2 of the most well-known passages in Ecclesiastes. We're going to look at the poem in chapter 3, and then we're going to look at the end of chapter 12 and what comes before it, both of which I think are pretty well known to most people who are aware of Ecclesiastes. So let's consider this theme of time under the sun. So we're going to walk through these passages together, and I kind of arranged them in order of like the logical progression that we should learn. So we're going to start in chapter 8, we'll look at chapter 3, then we're going to look at chapter 9, then we're going to jump at 11, and then finish with chapter 12. So it'll be a little helter-skelter today, but stick with me and hopefully we can see what the preacher has to say to us about time, because this was really encouraging to me, so I hope it is for you. So we're going to start in chapter 8 of Ecclesiastes today, and we're going to look at 4 verses, Ecclesiastes 8, 6 through 9. So I'm going to start reading in verse 6 of chapter 8, and you can follow along. Ecclesiastes 8, verse 6. The preacher says, "Because to every purpose there is time and judgment, therefore the misery of man is great upon him. For he knoweth not that which shall be. For who can tell him when it shall be? There is no man that hath power over the spirit to retain the spirit, neither hath he power in the day of death. And there is no discharge in war, neither shall wickedness deliver those that are given to it. All this have I seen, and applied my heart unto every work that is done under the sun. There is a time wherein one man ruleth over another to his own hurt." So, what do these 4 verses teach me and hopefully teach us this morning about time? Now, this passage is kind of, I pulled it out of a bigger context, a larger context that we actually looked at earlier in our study of Ecclesiastes. This passage is in the context of dealing with bad rulers, with kings that are unjust or foolish in how they rule. And you kind of see that hinted at the end of the passage we just read in verse 9 when it says, "There is a time wherein one man ruleth over another to his own hurt." That's referring back to the larger context of this passage. But tucked into the instructions of the preacher in dealing with foolish or bad rulers, he has these verses that tell us something about time. And I think the first thing that the preacher wants us to see is that we don't have control of time. We don't know the future. It says that he knoweth not that which shall be in verse 7. Man doesn't know what is going to come. We don't know the future. Not only do we not know the future, but we can't control the future. Verse 8, "There is no man that hath power over the spirit to retain the spirit, neither hath he power in the day of death." So we don't know what's coming, and it wouldn't matter if we did, because we have no control over what will happen. So why take the moment to look at these 3 verses? What is it teaching us? It is teaching us that we are not in charge. We are not the master of time. We are not in control. And you're like, well, okay, yeah. But remember, Ecclesiastes is about tearing down false assumptions that often we are blind to how they have crept into our lives. So yes, we would all say, well, of course we can't control the future. Of course I'm not the master of time. But ladies, in what ways do we fool ourselves into thinking that we can control the future? Is your ability to plan and schedule your life, your day, your week, the years to come, is your ability to plan and schedule a God to you? Is it something that you worship? Is it something that is important to you and that you find comfort in? If you say to me, well, I don't know, Mel, how would I know? Well, I would say, what is your response when your plans and schedules fall apart or are taken from you? And I can smile because I can think of this even in the smallest way. I think of when I pick my children up from school and we come home from school, in my mind, I have a game plan for how the hours after school are going to go. We have homework, we have music practice, and then often there is some other chores or things that I want them to accomplish. I also have to get dinner going, and all of this needs to happen within a reasonable time so that we can all go to bed, and so that the kids aren't working, and then I just send them to bed. Like, they need some time to relax as well. And if I have this plan in my mind and then I get home and one of my kids just completely throws a wrench in it, like they just won't, they're dragging their feet, or something happens and I burn something in dinner and everything falls apart. And here's the question: how do I respond? Well, it kind of depends on the day. But I think you can understand where I'm going with this. My ability to plan and schedule my time and the future, was it a God to me? Was it something that I was placing false hope in? And the answer for me is always, well, how do I respond when it's taken from me? Now, that's kind of a small, I would say insignificant example or illustration, but we can broaden that out and we can do some really dangerous things with our lives where we are planning and we are scheduling for the future, and then when it completely falls apart, we don't know what to do and we shut down. Anybody remember 2020? People had planned their lives, they had planned their schedules, and all of a sudden, those plans were not able to happen. They were not allowed to live their lives the way they had planned to live it, and there were people who literally lost their mind. I saw people say and do things I never thought I would see other human beings say and do. And if I were being really snarky, I would say, I saw Christians say and do things that I never thought I would see Christians say and do. Why? Because their plans and their schedules were taken from them. We cannot control time. We are not the masters of our future. We should be stewards of what God has given us to do. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, we have to acknowledge that we are not in charge. In what ways do we try to mask our inability to control time? I just chuckle sometimes at how, especially women, just refuse to acknowledge the march of time. And I won't get specific, but like if you want to ask me how old I am, I will tell you. I have no problem telling people how old I am. And I'm not saying that it's a sin if you do. But maybe we should ask ourselves why we invest so much time and energy and effort into masking the march of time. And if we're doing it for God-honoring reasons, or if we're doing it because we feel out of control and we don't like it. I can't look like I'm 20 anymore. And I kind of don't want to. And that's okay. So, ladies, we're not in control of time. Let's not fool ourselves that we are. And let's ask ourselves, where are we not acknowledging the truth of that? And let's surrender it. We are not the masters of time. The next passage that I want to look at is in chapter 3. So if you could turn to chapter 3, please. So the first thing we're learning today is that we are not in control of time. We are not in control. Now, we've got another lesson to learn, and that's in chapter 3. So look at chapter 3. We're going to read verses 1 through 15. Oh, I didn't change it. We're going to read verses 1 through 11. So chapter 3, verses 1 through 11. Now, as we start reading this, you're going to say, oh, yes, this is that poem that everyone is really familiar with, especially if you're of a certain generation and you remember particular songs. I'm not of that generation, and I still know the song, so that's saying something too. Chapter 3, verse 1, down through verse 11, the preacher says, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. What profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboreth? I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also he hath set the world, stop for a minute. The Hebrew word that's translated world in the King James Version actually means a time that never ends. And so other translations will translate it eternity because it has that idea of a time or an age, which is I think where they get that word world, a time that never ends. So he hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also he hath set the world, or he hath set eternity in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. At the beginning of this passage, we have this beautiful poem that is meant to teach us something. It is not just there for the sake of a beautiful poem. The preacher is trying to teach us something. It uses various forms of parallelism to describe the different seasons of life. So in Hebrew poetry, you find this idea of parallelism. Well, you'll have two lines and they will relate to one another in some way. They will contrast, or they will amplify, or they will just repeat the same thing but in a different way. And so here throughout this poem we have couplets and they are all parallel. Each descriptive pair, though, is a merism. And I learned that word this week and I love it. So I get a little geeky about like poems and literary devices. I think they're super cool because they help me understand the intent of the author. And so here in this poem, we have this idea of a merism. Did anybody else come across that? It was in the study guide, right? So, okay, good. So I'm not talking too crazy. So a merism uses opposite ends of a whole to refer to the whole. It uses the two most extreme points, and then it uses those 2 points to also refer to everything that comes between those 2 points. We use merisms all the time, whether we realize it or not. We might say, I lost something, and so I searched high and low. That doesn't mean I walked around my house and I only looked at places over 6 feet and under 6 inches. That's not what it means. It means I looked really high, I looked really low, and I looked everywhere else as well. We might say, I cleaned my home and I cleaned all the nooks and crannies. It doesn't mean I only cleaned the corners. It means I cleaned everything. So it's important to understand this because the merisms of this poem point us to the ultimate lesson of the poem. When it says a time to be born and a time to die, it is not only talking about the moment of birth and the moment of death. It is talking about an entire life. What is it teaching us about our entire existence on this world? It is teaching us that God is in control. In verse 11 it says, God hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also God hath set the world in their heart. It is God who puts eternity in our hearts so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. God is in control. We cannot control time. God is in control of time. Ladies, we call this the sovereignty of God. Let's define our terms. What does it mean when we say God is sovereign? Now, wrapped up in that word sovereign is the meaning that is implied. Often that word sovereign is used as a noun to refer to someone, to refer to a king, a ruler. And so when we talk about the sovereignty of God, we are saying that God is the ruler over everything. God has the authority to rule. He is the ultimate authority. He is the ultimate ruler and has ultimate power to control all things. The sovereignty of God is a fact that we can either submit to as true or fool ourselves into denying as false. But ultimately, it doesn't matter because He is sovereign whether we like it or not and whether we acknowledge it or not. But I think this poem is also pointing us to another truth about God that has a different name, but is as closely related to the sovereignty of God as two sides of a coin. The providence of God. Let's define our terms. What do we mean when we talk about the providence of God? In that word, you hear the word provide. And so the providence of God is how God's sovereignty applies to us. God's sovereignty is a fact. He is the ultimate authority. He has power. But He could still be sovereign and never act in our lives and in His creation. He could be the ultimate ruler who never interacts with His subjects. And the providence of God says that God is sovereign, and then He also is completely involved in our lives and in creation. This is how God's sovereignty applies to us. The providence of God tells us that God chooses to exercise His sovereignty by guiding and caring for us and all of His creation in a wise and purposeful way. Two sides of the same coin, the sovereignty of God, His right to rule, and the providence of God, His wise and purposeful care for us and creation. He not only has the authority, but He uses His authority to order our lives for our good. He hath made everything beautiful in His time. He is the one who orders that there is a time to be born and a time to die. And the Mirism tells us that He also orders everything in between. This poem screams the sovereignty and providence of God. He has ordained every season and time. He has made everything beautiful. He has put eternity in our hearts to turn our hearts towards Him in the first place. So first, we must recognize that we are not in control. And then secondly, we must recognize the sovereignty and providence of God, that He is in control. But now that we have wrestled with these two truths, what do we do now? And I think Ecclesiastes actually has an answer for that as well. And so now I would like to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Go to Ecclesiastes 9, and we're going to start in verse 4. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 4, and we're going to read down through verse 10. Chapter 9, verse 4, the preacher says, "For to him that is joined to all the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they shall die, but the dead know nothing. Neither have they any more a reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love and their hatred and their envy is now perished. Neither have they any more a portion forever in anything that is done under the sun." Now let's pause. What is the preacher saying in these opening words? He's saying it's better to be alive than to be dead. That's all he's saying it. He's saying it very descriptively and poetically, but he's trying to get a point. He's trying to get across the point that if you are alive today, you have something to be grateful for, because the dead no longer have any part in what is done under the sun. So if we're going to affect our lives, if we're going to change anything about what it's like to live under the sun, if we're going to do any good in this world, we have to be alive to do it. So it is better to be alive than to be dead. Now, verse 7. At the beginning of verse 7, I really feel like we could insert the word therefore, because he's just given us an instruction or a teaching. It's better to be alive than to be dead if you're going to try to accomplish something. Therefore, do this. Okay, so verse 7, just in your heads, hear a little therefore. Verse 7. Go thy way, eat thy bread with joy, and drink thy wine with a merry heart, for God now accepteth thy works. Let thy garments be always white, and let thy head lack no ointment. Live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest all the days of the life of thy vanity, which he hath given thee under the sun, all the days of thy vanity. For that is thy portion in this life, and in thy labor which thou taketh under the sun. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. For there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave, whither thou goest. So we've seen that we are not in control of time. God is in control of time. So what should we do? Thirdly, don't waste your life. Don't waste your life. He says and I love this, at the end of verse 9. He tells us, he's just said, live joyfully and enjoy what God has given you, for that is thy portion. So how are we not going to waste our life? We first need to accept our portion that we have been given. Now, when it says go thy way, eat thy bread, drink thy wine, live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest, it's not just talking to married people. It is not just talking about marriage. He is using these descriptively and poetically to just refer to whatever God has given you. Whatever God has given you. Everyone in here has a different portion from God. Your portion is not the same as my portion, and my portion is not the same as yours. We have to accept thy portion. I even see this hinted at the beginning of verse 7 when it says, go thy way. Not go somebody else's way. Not go try to live someone else's life. No, go your way and accept your portion. So the first step to not wasting the life that God has given me on this earth is to accept the portion that he has given me. And then secondly, I am to, once I accept my portion, live it joyfully. Live joyfully. Go and eat thy bread with joy. Drink thy wine with a merry heart. And then lastly, if I'm not going to waste my life, I'm going to accept what God has given me. I'm going to rejoice in it. And then I'm going to get to work. I'm going to work hard. Verse 10, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do. And again, don't picture like I'm walking around and I just bump into something like, oh, look, I found something to do. No, think of the context of the passage. Whatever God has given your hand to do. Right? Because God has given you something, right? And it's like, look down and whatever you find in your hand, do it. Because God has put it there. Whatever your hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might. There is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave. Whatever your hand finds to do, work hard. At whatever age or season you are in. This is not just a word for young people. It is a word for all of us. All of us. There's a quote from the study guide. It's just this little thing that she says in the middle of this larger paragraph that struck me. The limits of time should motivate us to use it well. The limits of time should motivate us to use it well. I don't know how many of you were here several Sundays ago when the Fitzgeralds were here. Buddy was here on a Sunday night and he was talking about his desire, even after 17 years of being in the same place, to still go into the tribes and bring the gospel to people who have not yet heard. And he said that people have said to him, like, why are you still pushing to do this even after you've been there for so long and you're not 20 years old anymore? And he said, because we realize we don't have all the time in the world. We realize our time on this earth is fleeting. And I was sitting back there and I was like, Ecclesiastes. The limits of time should motivate us to use it well, but it's usually the opposite. It's usually once we finally stop fooling ourselves and we get smacked in the face with the limits of time, most people shut down. They're like, oh my goodness, I'm going to die someday. Right? Because we all think we're immortal until maybe, 30, 35, and you're like, my time is so fleeting. And we start adding it up like, oh, okay, if I live to 75, then I probably have this many years left. I live to 80, well, my grandma lived till 90, so I live till 90, maybe I have this many years left. And we start making these calculations and we freak out. The limits of time, we should work harder and harder the closer we get because we realize we have less time to do what needs to be done. We realize we only have a few more years to glorify God. The limits of time should motivate us, excuse me, to use it well. Don't worry about what you haven't been able to do in the past. Does that paralyze anyone else but me? Have you ever sat around and thought, man, I really thought by this time in my life I would have been able to do this. Like I really wish I could go back in my 20s and do a whole bunch more stuff. I kind of thought I would have accomplished more. I didn't get to do this and I thought I would. My life didn't pan out this way and I thought it would. I didn't get to do what I thought I would do. And it's like, I feel like, what's the point now? Why start now? It should be the opposite. Don't worry about what you haven't been able to do in the past. Use the time you have left well. Keep doing what you can. What you can. Not what I can, what you can. Because everyone in here has different gifts and abilities and strengths. Do what you can. Keep doing not only what you can, but what you should, which is whatever God has placed in your hand to do. Look down at your hands, ladies, and whatever you find there, do it with all your might. The last passage I want to look at today is in chapter 11. We're going to start at the end of chapter 11, and then we're going to march all the way through to the end of chapter 12. In our final passage to consider in Ecclesiastes, here in the end of 11 and into the beginning of 12, I think the preacher is giving us another merism to consider. And it could just be because I just got really excited about learning about merisms, and now I see them everywhere. But I really feel like there's another one for us to consider here. So in our final time together, we're going to consider life and death and everything in between. Let's start reading in chapter 11, verse 7. We're going to read just 2 verses and then we'll stop. Chapter 11, verse 7. Truly the light is sweet, and a pleasant thing it is for the eyes to behold the sun. But if a man live many years and rejoice in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. All that cometh is vanity. Now, as much as I would love this to be like a verse for all Michiganders, the light is sweet and it is beautiful for my eyes to behold the sun, which I was like, amen, especially in February. It's not actually talking about physical light. He is using a metaphor to refer to life and death. When he says it is a pleasant thing to behold the sun, the light, he is talking about life, about the fact that you are alive today, and it is a pleasant thing. It is sweet. What is he telling us? Be thankful for your life. And then he says, why should we be thankful for our life? Because the days of darkness are many. Life is brief. It is hevel. It is fleeting in comparison with death. We're going to be dead a lot longer than we are alive. Okay, not counting the resurrection of the dead. So remember, your life is short. That's the point that he's making for us today. Our life is brief. Be thankful for it, because all that's coming, it says at the end, all that cometh is vanity. That's the word hevel. Because all that comes is hevel. Let's keep reading. Verse 9. Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart and in the sight of thine eyes. But know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. Therefore, remove sorrow from thine heart, and put away evil from thy flesh. For childhood and youth are vanity. Now the preacher is making another comparison. In the first two verses, he was drawing a comparison between life and death, and now he's making a comparison between the youth of our lives and the old age of our lives. What is he saying? Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth. When you're young, enjoy it. Rejoice, O young man. Let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth. Remove sorrow from your heart. When you're young, enjoy it. Why should young people do this? Because childhood and youth are hevel. They're fleeting. They only last for a little bit of time, so they should enjoy it, right? And we see this. There's something very, very wrong about a child who has a terrible childhood and who lives in abuse and agony and doesn't even know how to enjoy their childhood. There is something so wrong and broken about that. We want to see children who are just full of life, and they get so excited about dandelions and about rainbows. That's what we want to see. Why? Because childhood and youth are fleeting. They should enjoy it. But he cautions them. He's not just talking about little babies running around. He's talking about people, adults, in the prime of their life and their youth. And he says, enjoy it. But remember, we are not talking about hedonism here. We are not to abandon ourselves to whatever pleasure fulfills our selfish desires. He cautions them, enjoy your youth, but do it remembering that one day God will judge. Do it while submitting your life to the sovereignty of God. The preacher has already told us that making pleasure the God of your life is hevel. This is not a call to that. It is a call to enjoy the gift of your youth that God has given you in God's way. And we'll continue this theme in the next phrase as well. Look at the very next verse, which leads us into chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 1. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. Days of youth, again, is contrasted with evil days. He's still giving us this contrast of young life versus old life. The evil days refers to old age, the days we have no pleasure in. This is a very pessimistic view of old age, but he's allowed to think this if he wants. Perhaps he's just being overly poetic. I read this and I was thinking through this, and I remember so vividly my grandfather, my Grandpa Meckling. And we would go and visit him, and he lived until he was 91. And my grandpa was one of these like big, strong men. He raised horses, he broke horses, which tells you that not only was he strong, but he was very gentle. He could build a house from the ground up. He was just one of those men. He was very soft-spoken, very kind, but very strong. And I will never forget, as an adult coming back to visit him and walking into his house, and I can picture him sitting in his chair, and he'd be like, Melanie, don't grow old. Melanie, just never grow old. It's terrible. And my grandpa was a preacher. He was a preacher for decades, way before I was ever alive. He was a preacher. He loved the Lord. He was a godly man. He wasn't saying that his life was meaningless and that he hated every moment of it. He was just acknowledging the truth that it is hard to grow old. So maybe I'll forgive the preacher a little bit when he calls old age evil days. Maybe it was a day where his rheumatism was bothering him. I don't know. My grandpa was just acknowledging the truth that it's hard to see your body wearing out. It's hard to lose strength. And I think this is what the preacher is thinking of as well because of what follows. Let's keep reading. Chapter 12, verse 2. While the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look out of the windows be darkened, and the doors shall be shut in the streets when the sound of the grinding is low, and he shall rise up at the voice of the bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. Also when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fear shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshopper shall be a burden, and desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. Or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl be broken, or the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Here, in one of the probably second most recognizable passages in Ecclesiastes, the preacher uses metaphor to describe how our bodies break down as we age. In some cases, it's clear what the metaphors are referring to. Everyone's favorite is when he says the grinders cease because they are few, which we think refers to your teeth falling out. The keepers of the house shall tremble, your hands start to shake, strong men shall bow themselves, your muscles weaken, and your body becomes stooped. Those that look out of the windows be darkened, we begin to lose our eyesight. He shall rise up at the voice of the bird, they can't sleep well. Perhaps you're at the point where you can sympathize with some of these descriptions. In some cases, it is clear what the metaphors are referring to, and in others, it is not as clear. Regardless, the preacher is describing the end of our lives as we return to dust. You see that at the end of verse 7. And our spirit returns to the God who gave it. And the whole point of this passage, the whole point is back in chapter 12, verse 1. The whole point is that we are to remember our Creator in the days of our youth before we get to the old age He so poetically described for us. The passage of the point is clear. We are to remember our Creator. What does remembering God as our Creator actually mean? I think there's significance in Him. He didn't just say, remember God in your youth, or remember that God's going to judge you. Remember that God is judge in your youth. No, He said, remember God is Creator. He used a very specific word to refer to God. He called Him our Creator. What's the significance of that? What does it mean that God's our Creator? It means He's in charge. He made us. It's a reference back to His sovereignty. He is in control. He's the Creator. We're the creature. We are not in control. Once again, we are not in control of our time, our future, how our bodies age even. It's all hevel. We can do all we want to do and invest in every anti-aging cream we want to. And some things are just inevitable, right? At some point, you're going to have to say, hevel. God is in control. It's all fleeting. He is sovereign, and He works out His sovereignty in our lives through His providence. He is wisely and graciously ordering our lives. He is our Creator. Are you young today? Remember your Creator. Are you old today? Remember your Creator. Are you anywhere in between? Remember your Creator. Life and death and everything in between is under the sovereignty of God. So lastly, let's look at the conclusion of the matter. Let's keep reading. Chapter 12, verse 8. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. And moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even words of truth. The words of the wise are as goads, and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. And further, by these, my son, be admonished. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Now here, if you have to kind of cast your minds back all the way to week 1, where I mentioned that it seems to me there are 2 voices in the book of Ecclesiastes. We have the author, you could call him the narrator. He's the one who compiled the words of the preacher. He seems to refer to the preacher as a separate person in the third person. And so when I just read the text of Ecclesiastes, the plainest, simplest reading of it, to me, there seem to be 2 voices. So here I think we actually are hearing not from the preacher, but from the author who compiled the preacher's teachings. Here I think we have the author's closing thoughts, because it seems to me that the author and the preacher are 2 different people. Now, it is not a huge deal if you disagree with me. In fact, lots of good people wouldn't see it this way, but also lots of good people would. It just seems to me, again, the plainest reading of the text. And you guys already know how I feel about Solomon. So this is, to me, this is the author kind of wrapping up the words of the preacher that he has compiled and presented to us in the book of Ecclesiastes. It doesn't really change the meaning of it, regardless of who you think is saying the words, though. What does the author say? Well, he tells us, hey, the preacher was wise. He was a wise man. And he tells us the preacher taught the people, and the preacher not just taught the people, but he took the time to record his wisdom for the people in the form of proverbs and books. And before you come at me with, didn't Solomon write proverbs? A proverb is a literary form, just like a poem. And Solomon is not the only man in the world who wrote proverbs. Now, he did write Proverbs, capital P, as in the book of the Bible, but he's not the only person who's wrote Proverbs. In fact, in the book of Proverbs, there are multiple authors that Solomon collected Proverbs from. So again, you're allowed to think that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, but this isn't like a definitive proof to me to change my mind. I still think the preacher is just anonymous. So the preacher was wise, he taught the people, he recorded his wisdom for the people in the form of proverbs and books. And then the author has this lovely little caution, where the author, he cautions the person reading this against, again, exalting wisdom above God, of putting wisdom in too high a place in your mind and your heart and your life. And he does this when he says, writing books is endless and much study wears you out. That's my paraphrase of it, right? Now, he's not saying that you should never go to the library and students shouldn't take this verse to their teachers and be like, see? Studying is pointless. That's not what he's saying. He's saying if you exalt wisdom, if you think your wisdom is going to discover the ultimate secret to life, that you're going to write the greatest book and they'll never write books again. He's saying don't even think that, because the writing of books will never end. And if you think your wisdom is going to unlock the secrets of life, you will wear yourself out. And then it's like he keeps going and he says, here's the secret of life. Here's the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. What does it mean to fear God? Do you remember talking about this last week? Fearing God is an awe, a reverence, a respect. Really, all 3 of those words wrapped up together. It is an awe that results in obedience. It is not a terror that results in avoidance. And this is reflected in the text itself. We are to fear God and obey. We are to fear God and live in obedience. We are to fear God and keep his commandments. What's the conclusion of the matter? Life is hevel. And remember, there's 2 sides to the meaning of hevel. Life is fleeting, but also life is confusing. Life is short, but also life just doesn't make sense. It's like a column of smoke that looks solid, and as soon as you go to grab it, your hand passes right through because it doesn't make sense. It looks to be one thing, but it turns out to be something else. Life is hevel. Sometimes we feel like everywhere we turn, we see things that don't make sense. We see the crooked ways that have not yet been made straight. We see vanity and vexation of spirit. We see hevel. Romans 8 speaks to this as well when it says, Creation itself was subjected to vanity. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. For we know that the whole creation groaneth in pain until now. Have you ever read these words in Romans 8 before? Well, now forevermore, I am going to read these words and I'm going to think Ecclesiastes. Because that's exactly what Paul is describing. Creation itself is groaning under the weight of the hevel. But Paul goes on and he says, not only creation, but we also groan within ourselves, waiting. But there's a word that comes after that word waiting. Waiting for. Because we don't wait in hopelessness. We wait in hope. And what is it that we are waiting for? We are waiting for the redemption of our body. In the same way that creation is waiting for the recreation, we are groaning and waiting for the redemption of our body. What is Paul illustrating for us in Romans 8? That sometimes the groaning of creation and the groaning of our own hearts is overwhelming. But the answer is that one day Christ will return and make all things new. And we can hope in this because we acknowledge that God is sovereign. Do you not see? He must be sovereign. If he's not in control, then he has no authority or power to come back and fix the hevel. He is in control, not us. So we live in the fear of the Lord and we keep his commandments. And this is the whole conclusion of the matter. Let's pray.